As everyone knows, we're here to hear more about bats and the work that CWF is doing on our bat conservation work. So I, first of all, would like to say welcome to everybody on our webinar. This gets a lot of attention at this time of year. Bats are closely tied to Halloween, and while it presents a great opportunity to chat about bats, they're not necessarily as scary as people think and make them out to be. So it's great to talk about bats around Halloween, but it's the kind of the perception and perspective that they get sometimes a little unfair, but they're still fitting for this time of year. So also to let you know, this webinar and others that we've delivered on various topics can be found on CWF's website. This is being recorded, so the recordings of this and other websites can be found there. You can Google CWF webinars and find that. I'm also going to drop a link to that in the chat for everybody once I'm done talking as well. I would like to begin as well by acknowledging with immense gratitude that the land from which the Canadian Wildlife Federation is located and where I live and work and play is the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. The Algonquin people have inhabited and cared for these lands long before today. And so we take this time to be grateful for the care and their care and show our gratitude and respect to them and to the land for all that it provides us. I'm James Pagé. I'm a Species at Risk and Biodiversity Specialist here at CWF, and I, along with my colleague Emily Becker, are going to be your hosts for today. And Bailey will be our main presenter. Bailey is a graduate of the University of Ottawa with a master's in biology and a focus on environmental sustainability. She worked as a research assistant studying bats throughout the summers of her undergraduate degree, which led her to completing her master's thesis on mercury concentrations in bats in Eastern Ontario. She has been working with Canadian Wildlife Federation for about 2 years now as a bat researcher, bat research technician, and helping with the Canadian Bat Box project, with which I'm sure some of you are aware of and maybe a part of, as well as some other bat research we've been doing here at CWF. So she's done a lot with us, and happy to have her with us. A little bit about the Zoom controls. If you're having problems with audio, if you are, you may not be able to hear me. So you check your audio settings to be sure that Zoom has access to your speakers or your headphones, obviously. If playing around with that doesn't seem to work, often if you leave the webinar and come back using that same link that you joined, sometimes we'll fix it. On that same note, if for whatever reason we get cut off from this webinar, lose power or internet, whatever, it's happened once, we'll get it up and running right away again, so you can rejoin using that same link as well. I already mentioned about the chat, so only Bailey, myself, and Emily will be able to see those. So use that for any technical issues, problems, something you want to get out to us if you can't hear us properly or something like that. The Q&A is what we're going to use to pose questions. So write them in as we go. As a question pops up in your mind, they'll go into the Q&A, but we'll address all of them at the end. Bailey may touch on some of the answers during our presentation, but we'll also compile, and Emily is going to be compiling those questions, and we'll pose them back to Bailey all at the end. As well as that red box shows, for those that are hearing impaired, you can click the live transcription that you should see at the bottom of your page, and that will show, you can choose the option to show subtitles. Really quickly, CWF, we're one of Canada's largest conservation organizations. We undertake projects in conservation across the country. Our mission is to conserve and inspire the conservation of Canada's wildlife and habitats for the use and enjoyment of all. We do this in a number of ways. We have kind of a few main streams, which you can see here on the screen. A few things to touch on that we do is engaging the public and youth in citizen or community science, like programs like iNaturalist Canada, which we run, education programs like Wild Outside and the Canadian Conservation Corps. And we also undertake specific research and restoration projects in the freshwater, marine, and terrestrial environments, many of which target species at risk, like the right whale, the Blanding's turtle, which you see in the second photo from the top, the monarch butterfly, and of course, bats, several of which are endangered in Canada. And with that, I will turn it over to Bailey for her to talk more about our bat work and bats in general.
Thank you, James, for the introduction and the land acknowledgement. So I'm just gonna share my screen. All right, James, could you confirm that? Okay, perfect.
Yeah, we got it perfect, thanks.
Okay. All right, so hi everyone. Like James said, I'm Bailey Bedard. I'm a bat research technician working for the Canadian Wildlife Federation. And today I'm gonna be going over some general bat information and bat conservation stuff, as well as some of the bat research we do here at the CWF. So bats are a very diverse and ecologically important order of mammals. Some of them can feed on nectar, acting as pollinators. Some feed on fruit and help to disperse fruit seeds. Some feed on insects. Some even feed on fish. We have 19 different bat species throughout Canada. And all of our Canadian bat species are insectivores, playing the role of nature's pesticide. They have very high energy demands to make up for full nights of flying, and they can eat up to 100% of their own body weight in just one night of feeding. So because of this high consumption rate, they help to control and manage the population of many insect species, including agricultural pests, and they end up saving Canadian agriculture an estimated $30 million a year on pesticides. Some of our species in Canada are migratory, flying south like some of our birds do in the winter. And other species will hibernate in buildings or abandoned mines or caves throughout the winter. Some of our bats are not doing so well. Millions of bats have been wiped out in Canada due to a deadly fungal disease, which I'm sure many of you have heard of by now. This is called white nose syndrome. The fungus was introduced in North America in 2006 in caves where the bats will go to hibernate, and it spread over the years, which you can see on this map, starting in New York and moving out east in Canada, and now it's starting to make its way west. So this fungus has decimated bat populations since it spread in 2006 onward, and it's landed 3 of our Canadian species on the Species at Risk Act in 2014. So that's the little brown myotis, the northern myotis, and the tricolored bat. So the way this fungus works is it lives in the caves that the hibernating bat species will go to for the winter. And the fungus then grows on their face and their skin and ends up disrupting their hibernation. And this results in the bats becoming dehydrated or starving and ultimately leads to death. So scientists over the years have been working on different ways to deal with white nose syndrome, but the research just isn't quite there yet. So a lot of other bat research is focused on lessening the effects that other threats bats are faced with have on the bats to protect the ones that we do have left, because at this point, every individual counts. So these are some photos that show the fungus growing on the face and the skin of the bats in the cave. Some of the other threats that bats are faced with include the increasing use of wind turbines, which in some areas actually kills more bats than birds. Habitat degradation and loss is a big one due to urban expansion. And agricultural practices, including the use of pesticides, is a big one as well. Habitat loss also includes bat evictions from human-occupied buildings or attics. And so efforts to protect and provide alternative potential roosts, especially in human-disturbed areas, are thought to help boost survival and the reproductive success of bats. So this includes carrying out bat exclusions from a building or an attic in a proper way to lessen the adverse effects it might have on that roost. Of course, it's important to avoid coming into close contact with bats, and so a lot of homeowners will evict bats from their homes when they are occupying them, but it's important that that process is done properly while considering the timing within the season and offering alternative habitat for those bats to move into. And so this infographic shows when the best time to plan an exclusion of bats from a building or an attic. In late spring to the end of August, it's important to leave the roost alone during this time. This is because starting about May, bats are arriving to their summer roosts. The females are pregnant and the pups are born sometime within June or early July, but most aren't able to fly until mid to late August. So if you were to block any holes or install one-way doors during this time period, it would allow for the mothers to leave for the night to feed, but it wouldn't allow them to come back in at the end of the night to feed their pups. And with the pups not being able to fly during this time, they would ultimately starve inside the roost. September through October, the bats are all beginning to move to their hibernation sites. And so the pups at this time of year will be able to fly. And so it is ideal to install one-way doors at this point in time so that when they're leaving for the night or to head off to their hibernation site, all bats in that roost will be able to leave and you're not blocking any in there. There are species in Canada, like the big brown bat, that can choose a building to hibernate in over the winter rather than moving to caves or mines. So it's important that you're still checking for the presence of bats if you're planning to block any holes over the winter. And then in early spring, March, April-ish, the bats will be returning to their summer roosts. And it is possible to install one-way door at this time of year, although the females will be pregnant at this point in time, and it could cause extra energy and stress for the mothers to then find a suitable roost once they're denied access to their old one. So it's best to avoid that time as well. Installing a bat box is a common way homeowners try to encourage bats to move out of their homes or attics and into the boxes. So the installation of a bat box is often paired with a planned out exclusion. However, bat boxes are also installed a lot of the time just for the purpose of viewing wildlife in your own backyard or pest control in your backyard. And so lots of people have increasingly begun to install bat boxes. In Canada, big brown bats, little brown myotis, and the Yuma myotis are known to use bat boxes as maternity roosts, where the females will give birth to and raise the young of the year. But other than that, very little is known about what species are using bat boxes because there's very little research done on this subject matter across Canada. Studies have been done in other places around the world, but there's a knowledge gap that exists in Canada that needs to be addressed because with Canada's colder climate, bat boxes here are typically designed to increase the internal temperature of the boxes to provide warm quality roosts. However, there's now an increase in concern that the bat boxes are actually overheating more often, which can lead to stress and dehydration of the bats. 40 degrees Celsius is thought to be the kind of threshold where bats are then posed with increasing body temperature and risk of lethality. And there's been documented mortality events in British Columbia related to bat box temperatures over 50 degrees Celsius. So understanding how factors like temperature affect the use of bat boxes as a roost is a high conservation priority for our Canadian bat species. And when it comes to bat box design, there's tons of variability out there. So oftentimes you will see these sort of DIY styled bat boxes or similar style, which you can buy off Amazon or from Home Depot, etc. But in reality, there's a lot more variety out there. You can have a rocket box style like this one here. This is from a participant in our bat box study who took a few of these DIY boxes and screwed them all together to make a multi-chambered box. We have bat condos, which are essentially just bigger bat boxes that can house more bats. And this style here, which I believe is more popular in Europe than Canada, but it's, instead of being made out of wood, it's made out of a mix of sawdust and concrete. You can also have variability in how the bat box is installed, like how high it's installed, what you install it on, what way it faces, and all these different parameters can have an influence on the microclimate within the bat box and therefore the occupancy by bats. And so the objective of our Canadian bat box study, which the CWF is a partner on, is to fill the knowledge gap that exists in Canada in order to inform the recovery of our endangered bats and address the increasing threat of habitat loss. So to do this, we are trying to address a set of key questions. So what type of bat boxes are being used across Canada, and how do the varying parameters of these bat boxes affect occupancy by bats? How does the microclimate of boxes vary based on style, placement, geographic location? And are any of these factors related to overheating events? So by answering these questions, we can determine and promote the best bat box design for our Canadian climate and determine how valuable bat boxes are for bat conservation, while also identifying new maternity roosts and promoting the need for public reporting of bat observations by citizen scientists. And so to answer these questions, we have been collecting data on bat boxes over the past 2-3 years by incorporating unpublished bat box data sets with data collected from citizen scientists and regional collaborators, which were recruited through different outreach and media outlets. And the participants would register their bat box to our project by completing our bat box detail survey online. And here they fill out information regarding the physical characteristics of their bat box, whether it has been occupied in the past or currently occupied or unoccupied. And then they were provided with instructions on how to monitor their bat box during the field seasons using our standardized protocol. The participants would also be given the option to install these temperature data loggers, which are photographed in these two pictures here, which record temperature and humidity in the front and the back of the chambers of the box. Participants could also opt to collect guano for species identification if their box was occupied, and swab kits to test the occupied boxes for the presence of the fungus that causes white nose syndrome, to see if the bat boxes act as kind of a proxy in the spread of white nose syndrome. Any overheating events would, of course, be recorded by our temperature data loggers. But in order to document the effects of high temperatures on the bats living in the box, we asked participants to monitor their bat box on particularly hot days to determine if the bats inside the box were exhibiting any signs of heat stress, like hanging out of the bottom of the box. And there were a few reports of this during our field seasons. So this is another photo of how the data logger would be installed in the bat box. You just screw the bottom of that wire to the base of the box and then hoist the data logger up into the box using that wire, which is pretty rigid and keeps the logger propped upwards throughout the summer. And so this is a map that shows geographically all of the registered bat boxes in the project to date, both occupied in blue triangles and unoccupied, which are the gray squares. And so we have boxes in every province and pretty much every territory throughout Canada. And so using the data that we collected through the first few field seasons, we did some preliminary analysis to investigate the successfulness of bat boxes. So at the point in time of these analyses, we had 1,358 bat boxes. 1,358 bat boxes reported through our study. And of these boxes, 36.7% were occupied. And so we looked at a few of those parameters of the bat boxes to see if any of them, any parameter was able to explain or increase the likelihood that a bat box would become occupied. And so the first parameter we found was how long the bat box has been installed for. So the longer a bat box is occupied, the more likely it is, the longer a bat box has been installed, the more likely it is to become occupied. This is likely because the longer it's installed, the more a bat roost can kind of have the time to check it out and determine if it's a suitable habitat for them. So if you have a newly installed bat box within the past few years and it's still unoccupied, try not to get discouraged. Give it a few more years and you might get lucky. We also found that bat boxes that have been installed paired with a planned out exclusion from a human occupied building were more likely to become occupied than bat boxes that were just put up kind of for the fun of it. Again, this is likely because once a bat is forced out of its previous roost, it is then forced to try and discover new suitable habitat. And if a bat box is close by, they're more likely to check it out. We found that black bat boxes were more likely to overheat in the summers compared to lighter colored boxes like gray or brown boxes. Brown boxes are probably the best option because they're less likely to overheat, but they're still absorbing enough sunlight to provide a warm quality roost for the bats. We also found that boxes that are installed on poles are more likely to overheat than bat boxes that are installed on buildings or on trees. Boxes that are installed on buildings tend to have a more stable temperature, and bat boxes installed on trees are often shaded and actually don't typically reach high enough temperatures for bats to use it as a warm quality roost. And so the best bet is installing on either a building, and if that's not an option, a pole, although again, the pole is more likely to overheat on those hotter days. We also found that bat boxes that have no vents on them are more likely to overheat compared to bat boxes that have vents on both the front and sides and therefore promote airflow throughout the bat box. And so bat boxes without any vents are more likely to overheat. And so with these preliminary analysis, now keep in mind they are preliminary, so they have to be taken with a grain of salt. But based on the results so far, our key recommendations that we can make for using bat boxes as habitat compensation is to first have a network of several bat boxes rather than just one. So that way you're able to encompass a variation within all these varying parameters. And that way the bats can move from box to box depending on the temperature that day or the season. And so within your network of bat boxes, it's best to stick with installing bat boxes on a building. And if that's not an option, opt for a pole rather than a tree, because we find the boxes on trees often don't reach high enough temperatures for the bats. Painting the bat box a darker color, ideally brown, with a non-toxic and low VOC paint so that it's reaching warm enough temperatures, but it's not black and therefore not as likely to overheat in the summers. Having boxes that are bigger with 4 to 6 chambers compared to a single chamber box is more ideal, because again, that way you're increasing the temperature variation even within the box. So if it's a cooler day, the bats can move to the warmest chamber without leaving the box. And on the hotter days, they can then move back to the cooler chambers. And so with that being said, 2023 was our last field season for the project. So we're starting to kind of wrap things up now. All the data loggers across Canada are being mailed back to Emily, James, and I. And Karen, who is the lead researcher on this project, is going to have a huge data set to manage and analyze in order to gather the results and conclusions on the investigation of variation in bat box usage across Canada. So for now, we're continuing to promote the need for public monitoring and reporting of bat counts, not only for this kind of short-term project, but long-term in the effort to track bat population trends across the country. So you can find more information about the Canadian Bat Box Project and general bat information on www.helpthebats.ca. There you can also find DIY plans on how to build a bat box or what to look for if you are going to shop for one. And we also have a checklist on that website for installing a bat box. Additionally, you can visit www.batwatch.ca, and here you can register your bat box, upload your bat observations, and participate in the long-term monitoring of bat population trends and bat box usage, rather than just participating in our short-term project. I also threw my email up there that you can jot down if you ever have any questions about bats in general or CWF's bat research. And so in addition to that 3-year bat box study, we had some funding to execute bat tracking studies in Ontario over the past few years. And these tracking studies are focused specifically on little brown myotis because they are endangered, with the objective of identifying new little brown roost sites and determine what characteristics of roosts that little browns seem to prefer. So some of these tracking studies were also paired with an exclusion from a building to investigate where the little browns will go once they're excluded from their original roost. And for those studies that were paired with an exclusion, we would also deploy bat boxes at the capture site surrounding the original building roost to encourage the bats to use these alternative roosts and help supplement our data for the bat box study. So I won't go into too much detail about the different tracking studies, but I have some photos and about the capture and tracking process, because it's pretty interesting and a lot of fun to get to do. So this first photo here is of a building that bats were roosting in Parry Sound. I saw that we have a few people in the chat listening from Parry Sound. So this was in Parry Sound. This specific property had plenty of similar buildings on the site, which I believe all of which had bats living inside the buildings. And so the first tracking study carried out here, we attempted to exclude the bats. So you can see these one-way doors installed. They look like black screens on all the exit and entry points that we could find on the building, so that the bats could leave at night and then wouldn't be able to regain access, except they did regain access, and it was a failed attempt at an exclusion. But the property owner at that point was happy that the bats were using his buildings as a roost, and so he wasn't too particular about getting them out in the end. But we did install some bat boxes on the buildings and track the bats, which you could see. We're using radio telemetry here to track them, and I'll go into that a bit later. So yeah, what we found for this particular study is that the bats, again, they regained access to all these buildings, but some of them did end up using our bat boxes that we installed on the building. So that was exciting to see. And we were also able to track some of the bats to neighboring properties that had bat boxes on their property. And so again, that was really cool to see the kind of network that these bats had between all the buildings on this site and the neighboring buildings and bat boxes. So what these tracking studies entail is we need to capture the bats before we're able to track them. And so the capture nights involve setting up nets before the sun sets so that we are able to catch the bats as they're beginning to leave their roost. And so you could see an example of a net set up here. They look like giant volleyball nets, kind of. And then as the bats begin flying around at night, they get tangled in these nets, which doesn't hurt them. They just get a little tangled up, and we immediately untangle them, and we put them into these small bags that we call bat bags. In these bat bags, the bats are much calmer, so we'll leave them in these bags until we're ready to handle them. And so handling the bat involves weighing it, which we will do with the bat still in the bag. So what we'll do is we'll weigh the bag first, and then we'll weigh the bat inside the bag, and then we just subtract the total weight from the weight of the bag, and we figure out how much the bat weighs. Then we take the bat out of the bag, and we identify what species it is, if it's male or female, if it's an adult bat or a pup. And to do that, we will hold the wing out over a flashlight, and we'll look at its knuckles. So if you could see, it's kind of hard to see in this photo, but there's a little bulge here on its finger, and this is the bat's knuckle. And so if it was a pup or a bat that was born that year, the bone in this knuckle won't be fully developed. And so when you hold it over the light, you'll be able to see through it. But the adult bats do have a fully developed bone there. And so when you hold it over the light, you can't see through it. And so that's how we determine if it's an adult bat or a bat that was born just that year. Then we will slip a little band on the wrist of the bat, like you can see here in this photo. All of these bands have unique numbers on them to allow us to identify that bat again if we ever recapture it, or if another bat researcher happens to catch it. And then we put the radio tracker on the back of the bat. So we'll snip a little bit of its fur, and then we'll use a skin adhesive to attach the radio transmitter. And that allows us to follow the bats to their new roosts each day for the next 2 to 3 weeks. At that point, the tag will then fall off naturally as the fur begins to grow back. The glue kind of wears off. And so we get a 2 to 3 week time period where we're tracking the bats every day. And so after we put the radio tracker on, we release the bat. And so here's a little slow-mo video. You can see the transmitter hanging off the back of the bat. They're lightweight enough that they don't affect the flight of the bat. And so off they go, and then we're able to track it as soon as we release it. So typically we'll track a max of 12 bats at a time, because after 12, it starts to get kind of hectic tracking down any more than that. But we'll band and document the biological parameters, like the species and sex, for every single bat that we catch. So at our least successful capture, I can't remember if it was this year or last year, we caught only 3 or 4, and our most successful capture, we caught close to 130. So it really depends on the season or the roost, I guess. And so again, you can see in this photo here the unique band on the bat's wing. And this is a photo looking into a bat box from the bottom. And inside this bat box, we found a bat that we were tracking. And it's an example of what I was saying earlier, where we tracked this bat to a neighboring house near the capture site who had bat boxes installed on their house. And one of our bats that we were tracking just happened to use this bat box in part of its network. So that was cool to see. In this building, this is a site local to Ottawa, Max Skimming Education Center. This is where we had the least successful capture, where we caught only 3 or 4, but it's also where we caught 130 bats. So the capture success, again, is really dependent on how many bats are around at the time of year and where they're roosting. So all of our tracking studies throughout the years have showed us that bats have a network of roosts that they will use depending on the day, and it's likely weather dependent and seasonally dependent. Seasonally dependent coinciding with their reproductive status. So for example, one of the tracking studies we did at this site, we did early on in the spring. So we were only tracking pregnant mothers, and we found that they did not switch roosts day to day nearly as much as when we went back in August and we're tracking mothers after they gave birth. We were tracking adult males and young of the year now that they were flying. And at that time of year, all of the bats were switching roosts nearly daily. So it was interesting to see how the reproductive status or the seasonal changes on roost usage. On the left here, we have a photo of a silvered hair bat, which was a rare capture for us, mostly because they typically fly really high over the forest cover at night, so our nets just don't reach that high. But also their populations are declining as well. So it was an exciting catch, and we ended up tracking this bat anyways, despite it not being our target species. And this species roosts in trees rather than buildings or bat boxes. So what this bat showed us was it just brought us to a new tree pretty much every day within the same portion of the same forest. And then on the left here is a bat box at one of the capture sites that was thought to be unoccupied for years and years. It's actually damaged. You can't see it in this photo, but the roof had fallen off. So it's just a wide open box, and they thought pretty much it's been unused and there was no sense in fixing it. But we actually did track one of our bats to it during one of our studies. So it does get some use. It was on a really hot day, so he's probably just out looking for a cooler spot with more airflow, and a spot with no roof is perfect for that. And this is an example of the maps that we put together after our tracking study with all the data we collected. Each color, which is hard to see in this photo, but I zoom in the next slide, I believe. So each dot is a different color, and it represents a different individual bat and where it chose to roost that day. The blue lines represent roads that we were driving on in search for bats that were missing, and we ended up not finding anything. And then the green lines, which again are hard to see in this photo, but you'll see them later. The green lines indicate roads where we did end up finding bats along that road. The red circle is a 10-kilometer radius around the capture site. Typically, bats don't travel very far between their roosts, although they can. But we usually found that bats were roosting within 3 to 5 kilometers at the most from their original roost site that we captured them from. And then the orange sort of buffer that's surrounding the roads that we tracked on, it represents the buffer distance of the transmitters that can be picked up from the receivers in the car, which is approximately half a kilometer. So as you're driving down the street, you can pick up roughly half a kilometer in the direction that the receiver is pointing. So this is a zoomed in version of this map. So this is from the data of the tracking study where we only captured a few bats, which is why there's only 4 different colors on there, but each color again represents a different individual bat. So for example, this area is the capture site, and the bat represented by the yellow dots switched from the original capture site building to a different building on the same property back and forth throughout the 2 to 3 weeks. The dot, the pink dot that represents a different bat shows that it was roosting between a tree within the forest on the capture site property and a shed on a neighboring property. The bat represented by purple was switching between a barn and a house on a neighboring property. And all these green dots over here represent that silver hair bat that I mentioned earlier that was switching between different trees within the same portion of forest nearby the capture site. So like I said, capture sites here, we found all of our bats on the same kind of 2 streets around the capture site. So they have a network of roosts, but they tend to stick close to the same area. And so that is all I have planned to talk about. I just want to take this time to acknowledge and thank our sponsors and partners, as well as all of you for joining us today and listening to some of the bat research going on at CWF. And I'll be happy to answer any questions during the question period at the end of this webinar. So thank you again for listening.
Thanks so much, Bailey. That was great. Good overview of what we've been up to, and some great points on the bat work and what our bats are doing. We do have a bunch of questions that came in through the Q&A. So if anybody has any additional ones, there's still time. You can write them in as we're posing those to Bailey. And with that, I'll hand it over to Emily, who's been looking at those and can put them forward.
Thanks, James. Yeah, that was great, Bailey. There's quite a few questions, some really good ones, so I'll just hop right into those. So our first one, Bailey, is could you talk a little more about how white nose syndrome was introduced in Canada and ways that we can prevent it from spreading further?
Sure. So I believe it was brought in from Europe into New York, like I mentioned, in 2006 by cavers and miners. So the fungus existed over there, and then they brought it in unintentionally, obviously, on some of their gear and equipment that they used. And then it just spread from cave to cave from there. And correct me if I'm wrong, James, but I believe the spread since then within the bat population is not totally known. So I mentioned that we were getting some of our participants to swab the bat boxes. And so the purpose of that is to test if there are any signs of the fungus that causes white nose syndrome existing in bat boxes in the summer. And the idea is that if a bat is exposed to the fungus in a cave while they're hibernating and they happen to survive it, but then carry it over into their summer roost in a bat box and expose other bats that happen to be roosting in the same box. So we're trying to see if bat boxes act as like a step within that process of the spread of white nose syndrome.
Yeah, and I could just add that like bats now, so it was, as Bailey said, was brought by humans. Right now, the transmission mostly in Canada is from bat to bat. There's a lot of awareness. I mean, cavers as well, they're exploring caves, can transport it as well, but there's a lot of awareness and protocols for entering and exiting caves now, that decontamination. And so not 100%, but there's a lot of good work being done on that front. So right now, as Bailey said, it's when bats survive the winter, and then they can transmit it from bat to bat. And as far as preventing that spread, it's really there. I don't think there is a way, honestly. So it's, as Bailey mentioned, it started more on the East Coast and it's making its way westward. And biologists are basically just bracing and waiting for it to hit out west because it's unfortunately a matter of time. So there's work being done to try and address the white nose syndrome itself, but there's no clear treatment for it.
That's great. So our next question is, so it's regarding bat boxes. So you did talk about this a bit, Bailey, when you mentioned how it's great to have a network of bat boxes. But someone was wondering if the individual bat boxes should be moved around depending on the season. So if it's better to have it in like a sunnier spot in cooler months and then move it somewhere else for warmer months.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I don't believe there's much known about that either. There's, as you can tell, lots of knowledge gaps. But um, so bats are very routine. And if they start using a bat box one summer, they're likely to return to that bat box the following year. And so it's my thinking that it would be best to maybe not move it so that they can come back to the same spot every year, and then they don't have to kind of fly around looking for it again. But they will likely have an established kind of network already, so that they can switch between. So I think keeping it in the same spot is probably the best move.
And
Okay.
and looking at that question too, there was a part of it was asking about whether it should be put in a certain area for winter hibernation. So Bailey, can you just maybe talk about what bats do in the winter as far as roosts go?
Yeah, for sure. So bats actually won't use the bat boxes at all in the winter months. They will either, um, if it's a big brown, it's likely to roost in buildings or caves. And then the little browns will move to caves or abandoned mines to hibernate. So the bat boxes don't actually get used throughout the winters. And so you can use the winter months to clean out any wasp nests while the bats are gone, because wasps love to make homes in the boxes. But yeah, there won't be any bats during the winter months in the box.
And kind of building off the first part of that question too, is there any way really to attract bats to a box if if they haven't found it yet?
Yeah, there has been research done on that. From my knowledge, none of which was successful in attracting bats to bat boxes. People have tried spraying the bat boxes with um, like bat guano or urine to kind of attract the bats to the scent. They've also have tried like physically taking a bat and putting it in a bat box, and usually the case is the bats just go back to their established network of roosts.
Okay, good to know. And for people who are wanting to put up bat boxes in their backyards, is there anything they need to worry about in terms of like attracting bats to their area, or is that usually pretty safe?
It is, of course, important to avoid coming into close contact with a bat. But like I mentioned, they're great at controlling insect populations. They're fascinating to watch flying around feeding at night. And so as long as you're not up close and personal with them, they're safe to have around.
That's great. We have another question here, which I think you did mention this in your presentation as well, but just to recap for anyone who missed it, is there a recommended direction to face the bat boxes when you put them up in terms of like north, south?
Yeah, so usually it's south to get the most sun exposure, because again, it's thought that bat boxes that are warmer will provide a better quality roost. We didn't find it to be a significant factor in our research so far. Again, everything's preliminary right now, so it might change depending on the data that we get back. But I think the most important thing is making sure it's in an area where it's getting a lot of sun exposure, and that there is maybe a side of the bat box that is getting less sun exposure. So again, if you're installing it on a building, then the outermost chamber of the box will be getting the most sun exposure, and it'll be the warmest chamber, and then the chamber not getting the most sun exposure will be a cooler chamber for the bats to move into. So you'll see facing south a lot of the time, but I think it's more important to install it on a way based on the resources you have to install the bat box or network of bat boxes in a way that just increases temperature variation so the bats can have choice.
Okay. This next question might actually be more for you, James. And it's just wondering if there are plans for CWF to release new plans for a box that has more than 2 chambers.
Yeah, that's good question. And Bailey, you also be up to speed on this, but so based on the results that Bailey was talking about, our next step is to reach out to bat box builders and work with one or more to try and build a new design that would be fitting of all the parameters that we're finding that have a better chance of attracting and housing bats. So once we have that information, the idea is, yes, to have some better designs, and we can also, yes, update our DIY ones that we have on our website. We created those to be as simple as well that kind of most people can do. They can be made out of one sheet of plywood. They can be cut at the hardware store. So it doesn't take a ton of building experience, a little bit, but not a ton. So we're trying to get that balance between, good enough to work for bats, but easy enough for people to build. But maybe we can get a second prototype there. That's kind of the next level up.
Okay, thank you. We also have some interest in whether or not the map of registered bat boxes that you showed earlier in your presentation, Bailey, if that is publicly available for people who want to know or check out boxes in like public parks, things like that. I know that there are quite a few private properties on there, so I don't know if there's someplace else they can go to find that information.
So that map I pulled from our lead researcher on the project, Karen Vanderwolf's newsletter that she puts out twice a year typically. And so that was the most up-to-date map from I believe it was the spring newsletter of this year. So that can be publicly viewed. It's the map itself, along with everything else in those newsletters. They're posted on the WSC's website, I believe, right, James? Yeah. So yeah, those newsletters specifically you can find on that website. If you are a BatBox participant, Karen should be emailing them out, I believe, to everyone in the list. And we will be posting our final results for this project in some sort of format through the CWF. And so you'll be able to see the results at some point. But as for the individual BatBox data, I believe most of it is actually private properties and such. So.
Okay, thank you. Okay, this one's kind of a two-part question on the best places to install bat boxes. So the first part is a nearby water source kind of great to have wherever you're going to set it up? And then the second part is light pollution a problem for them?
Yeah. So having a water source nearby it's actually one of the parameters we ask about when people were registering their bat boxes to this project. We ask how close the nearest body of water is. Bodies of water attract lots of insects. Lots of insects actually emerge in their adult form from the water. And so healthy insect populations will, of course, attract healthy bat populations. So a nearby water source is likely a good thing to have nearby a bat box. And as for light pollution, I know that bats do get quite irritated by light. And so when we do our bat box checks, Emily and I actually will shine lights into the bat box during the day. And as soon as we start doing that, we can hear the bats kind of start squeaking, annoyed at us. But I'm not sure if like an outside light would actually deter bats. Do you know anything about that, James?
In general, we suggest not putting the bat box right near like a bright outside light. But yeah, they will feed potentially around lights that attract insects, but they tend not to want to roost right kind of with a spotlight or bright lights shining on the box.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, that's good to know.
Yeah, and we are actually kind of out of time. There are a lot of really good questions still that people have asked that we unfortunately can't get to all of them. But will we do a follow-up email to everybody who's registered to the webinar so we can look at compiling these questions and maybe writing in some answers for some of the questions to send around to folks that everybody can see the question and the answer after the fact that we can put together. So yeah, unfortunately, we will have to wrap it up. I want to thank everyone, and especially Bailey for presenting, and Emily for fielding the questions and putting that together for us, and all the participants for your time and attending this. Yeah, it was great. And Bailey, we have several people writing in the chat and the Q&A that it was a great presentation, which I agree with, and you're a great speaker. So thank you so much for presenting this.
Thank you, everyone.
Have a good night, everyone.